Hi, and thank you for tuning into the Nature Conversations podcast. I'm Dr. Adam Forbes. I'm a forest ecologist who specialises in the restoration of New Zealand's forest ecosystems. This podcast isn't about me, however. The purpose of the Nature Conversations podcast is to capture knowledge and insights from remarkable people and to profile important issues for ecology and nature conservation. Today I'm joined by Associate Professor Tim Curran. Tim is a plant ecologist whose main area of expertise lies in using functional traits to understand how plants respond to extreme disturbance events, such as fire, drought, frost and cyclones. Tim's more recent work has been on comparative plant flammability to tackle a range of applied and basic topics. These include methods to measure flammability, traits associated with flammability, evolution of plant flammability, understanding how drought influences plant flammability, and identifying low flammability species to plant as green firebreaks across the landscape to reduce fire spread.
The predictions with global climate change are such that we're going to have increased temperatures. We're going to have drier environments, at least on the east coast of both major islands. We're going to have windier weather and we're going to have lower relative humidity. And all of those things are conducive to more destructive wildfires. New Zealand's a place, like many other Pacific islands, where we can actually get multiple wins out of fire mitigation. We can get biodiversity conservation wins, we can get food provision wins, we can get cultural reconnection wins as well too. So New Zealand could easily be an exemplar of fire management for the globe.
Well, I'm very excited to have Associate Professor Tim Curran join me for a conversation on Nature Conversations today. How are you today, Tim?
Yeah, very well, thanks, Adam. Kia ora, and thanks so much for having me.
It's my pleasure, Tim. Welcome. Tell me about your professional background and how you came to research plant flammability.
Yeah, sure. So I guess to start back right at the beginning, I grew up in country New South Wales in a little town called Gunnedah in northern New South Wales, and lived on the edge of town, not too far, like just 3 houses away from the bush, and used to spend a lot of my time going and building cubbies, just basically spending time in the bush. A lot of that was fostered by my mum. So mum has a degree in botany and zoology and was a high school science teacher. And she used to take me and my brothers on bushwalks when we were kids, sometimes reluctantly by me and my brothers, which was pretty funny, reflecting on where I've ended up and what I'm doing now. But also would take us to places like the rock pools around Nobby's Beach at Newcastle when we were on holidays. And so that sort of fostered a love of nature. From there, I sort of, kept being interested in natural things around my hometown of Gunnedah, things like koalas, spinifex grass, like a really spiky type of grass. And from there, decided that environmental science and ecology was what I wanted to do. And so I went down to the Big Smoke and went to the University of New South Wales in Sydney and studied a Bachelor of Environmental Science. And that's probably where my interest in fire, well, it's definitely where my interest in fire began, because we didn't really have too many big fires or any bushfires of note really around my hometown growing up. But the person who went on to become my honours supervisor, Professor Barry Fox, he was very interested in fire, and he was also the person who'd got and started this environmental science degree at UNSW, which had just started the year before. And so he used to take us for very focused classes for that small group of, there was about 25 of us doing the degree then. And I can still actually remember the very first week of lectures in my first year, and Barry was sort of had us for this particular subject. And I can even remember the first correct answer I gave in a lecture setting, and it was, he asked the question, what was the area of Australia that likely had the highest fire frequency? And a number of us, including myself, had a few goes and had got the wrong answer. And then finally, I realised that it was probably the grassy savannas up in the northern Australia. And of course, that was the right answer. And I can still remember that 30 years later. And Barry's interest in fire and a lot of the lectures that he sort of gave me a real interest in fire and fire ecology. So I ended up doing my honours on fire ecology in heathlands in Mile Lakes National Park, just north of Newcastle, which was really fun. And then sort of did about 4 years work between degrees, mostly on koalas and koala management, sort of reflecting back to my interest growing up. Then I went to the University of New England in Armidale, so just a couple of hours drive from where I grew up, and decided to study something completely different, was looking at dry rainforest and dry rainforest ecology. During that time, my supervisor, late Peter Clark, got me interested in plant functional traits. And from there, I sort of started to take an interest in things like how plants survive drought. So a lot of my PhD was looking at drought traits and how the evolutionary history of these dry rainforests pointed to them having evolved to become more drought adapted from their wetter habitat relatives over basically the gradual drying of the Australian continent. Then pretty much straight after my PhD, I got a job up with an organisation called the School for Field Studies in North Queensland. And 3 weeks after I arrived up there, a cyclone smashed through, tropical cyclone Larry smashed through our field station. And so I then started turn to looking at traits associated with cyclone damage, and did that for a little while. A year later, we had a really bad frost up in the tropics, and again looked at, and my students and I started looking at traits associated with frost. And then I guess I was sort of, looking around up there for other projects to do, and there's a really interesting patch of semi-evergreen vine thicket was the dry rainforest type that a lot of my thesis was looking at. And there's a national park called 40 Mile Scrub National Park to the west of Cairns, which is out in the savannah country, and it's this little patch of dry rainforest in the middle where it doesn't seem like it should be. It's by and large been protected by fire, except when it gets invaded by lantana. And so we'd been going out there a fair bit to do various different projects, mainly looking at drought traits in that dry rainforest. And I started to get interested started thinking, maybe we could do a project that actually would compare the flammability of lantana to that of the dry rainforest species, and actually answer the question, what was the mechanism behind lantana invading these ecosystems and changing the fire regimes, which of course then lead to, it's the fire lantana cycle, that whole fire invasive cycle where a pyrophilic or fire-loving weed gets into an area. It encourages fire that works against the native species, in this case the native dry rainforest species. You get more lantana, and then you get more fires, and you just get this cycle that basically degrades the rainforest, encourages lantana. And so we did that in our little bush lab in our site on the wet tropics rainforest. We were just using a basic one of those lighters, those long stem lighters, and we compared at a leaf level, a very tiny, very reductionist approach, compared the leaf level flammability of lantana to these dry rainforest species. Work that was being sort of led by my graduate intern, a guy called Carter Berry. And we found that lantana was actually not more flammable than most of the rainforest species, which was surprising to us. But We'd also, with another student, had taken measurements of the biomass of lantana in the field. And so that pointed that the mechanism is that lantana wasn't changing the inherent flammability of the fuels. What it was doing was changing the nature of the fuel loads. So there was a more contiguous layer of shrubby fuels, so more horizontally contiguous, and the lantana also created ladder fuels, which allowed the fire to get up into the canopy and do real damage to the rainforest. So that was a cool little paper. That was, sort of my first foray into plant flammability. And then 14 years ago, I landed this job here at Lincoln University. So my wife Penny is from Christchurch. She actually went to Lincoln University and was quite keen for us to get back here. Job came up. I was lucky enough to get it. And pretty much almost as I was winging my way across the ditch, or we were coming across to New Zealand in June of that year, the plant barbecue device was advertised. So this was a device designed by a group of Argentinians. A very famous ecologist, Sandra Diaz, was the PhD supervisor, and her PhD student, Pedro Jagaberry, basically designed the plant barbecue, which is a 44-gallon drum cut in half lengthwise, and then you lay it on its side, you put a grill on top, and you put the plants on top of that, and then you ignite them with a blowtorch, and then you measure a range of different features of how well the plant burns. And so I saw that in my, as a better way of, testing plant flammability than the little bush lab approach that we'd used. And I applied for some internal funding at Lincoln University at the end of that, at the end of 2011, got the funding, got the barbecue built, close to the end of 2012. And since then I've been burning plants to our heart's content and looking at a wide range of different things. It's a lot of fun. There's a lot of different avenues that we can, follow, with it. And it's just a really, really cool technique.
Oh, that's all so interesting. Thank you, Tim. So would you like to just step us through how you assess plant flammability?
Yeah, sure. So the way we do it on the barbecue is, as I mentioned, it's this 44-gallon drum laid on its side. We put the sample on there, and underneath the grill or underneath the mesh, we actually have a normal plant barbecue grill. So we actually turn that on, have that running the whole time, and that allows us to preheat the sample. And so what that does is it drives a bit of moisture out of the sample. It also volatilizes any oils, essential oils that the plant might have, which can be quite important for its flammability. So we put that on for 2 minutes, or put the plant on for 2 minutes, the sample, and then we ignite it with a blowtorch. And that blowtorch pumps out quite a bit of heat energy into the plant, into the sample, and we have that on for 10 seconds. We determine the ignitability of the plant by estimating what time during that 10 seconds the flame spreads beyond the flame of the blowtorch. And once we turn the blowtorch off, we measure 3 other things. So the first thing we measure is the maximum temperature reached. So we use a laser infrared thermometer to do that. People would be familiar with those if they were doing any travel during COVID. Those were the handheld guns, IR guns that got pointed at your forehead to measure your forehead temperature without contracting COVID from people you were measuring the temperature of. So we use one of those. We also estimate the percentage biomass that's been consumed by the fire. So we just do a visual estimate of that, like many ecologists do with things like canopy cover or cover abundance. And then we also use a stopwatch to measure the total burn time. So how long there's flaming combustion. So basically how long the flames last for on the sample. And then having those 4 different measures, we can then use a range of statistical procedures, including one that we often use, a principal components analysis, which reduces those 4 factors down to usually 1 or 2 main axes of variation in the data, and that allows us to compare the flammability of a wide range of species. It's a lot of fun to operate, and we often sort of get out there in the public and do outreach, so either show videos of it when we go and visit classrooms, or have a lot of schools and other groups come and see the barbecue in action, including a wonderful outreach program called Children's University that we have down here in Canterbury. So we get lots and lots of school kids coming in and getting to have a go at and burn plants with us, which they find a lot of fun, and we do too, because it gets them thinking about flammability and what drives it.
That's great, Tim. I can imagine a plant barbecue would be quite the centre of attention at some of these events.
Absolutely.
So are there plant traits which drive flammability?
Yeah, so there are. So this sort of links back to my earlier work back during my PhD and my interest in plant traits more generally. And we've actually been doing quite a bit of work on that over the years here, led by a number of my students. So my very first PhD student working in plant flammability, Azar Alam, his whole thesis was looking at traits associated with flammability. And there's a number of plant characteristics that influence flammability. Probably consistently the most important one or group of traits that influence flammability, are those related to moisture content. So quite simply, the more moisture a plant part or plant material has in it, the more difficult it is to ignite and to burn. And the reason for that is that a fire has to spend energy burning off that or vaporizing that water before it can actually get to the material that it can consume. And so any moisture that you have in there, and the higher the moisture content, the more that will impede both ignition and also how well the plant burns. One of the traits that is associated with that, or it's actually a converse to moisture content, is leaf dry matter content. And so that's quite simply the amount of dry material that a given plant sample has, or a leaf has. And leaf dry matter content has sort of consistently starting to be shown to be one of the key traits that are widely measured that could influence flammability. So that was a consistent finding in Azar's work and in his published papers, and it's sort of cropping up with others elsewhere as well too. There's other characteristics that influence flammability. Another important one is dead material. And in fact, the very first project we ran on the plant barbecue, going back a while now, would have been in 2013, although we didn't publish it for a few years after that, was run by Jenny Dent, an undergraduate student at the time, and she looked at how the amount of dead material influenced the flammability of gorse. And so gorse is one of the more flammable species in our New Zealand environment. Of course, it's an invasive weed, does the same sort of thing as what lantana does in the tropics and subtropics. Gorse can very much change, fire regimes, change the pattern of fire by promoting fire, being benefited by fire, and then sort of having this repeated cycle of fire begets lantana, begets more fire. And what Jenny showed with the gorse was that depending on the flammability variable, it sort of first of all, the key thing was if gorse doesn't have much dead material, it's not very flammable at all. So young green gorse doesn't burn well at all. However, once gorse starts building up and retaining that dead material, and of course it retains it in a nice architecturally appropriate way, then it becomes quite flammable, and that increases up to about 40% dead material, and then some of the flammability variables plateau at that point, so they don't increase much, although some of the others do continue to increase. So the proportion of dead material that a plant retains is important, and there's some suggestions that plants retaining dead material is an evolutionary adaptation to promote fire in certain species, certain groups. So in the pines, for instance, dead branch retention is considered to be a fire adaptation to increase flammability, and that's well correlated with other flammability survival traits like serotiny, which is canopy stored seed, and other groups like Banksias from Australia. Retention of dead materials been associated with the evolution of flammability. There's a range of other characteristics that influence flammability. So there's things like leaf size can have a role. Certain other morphological traits can be important. Leaf thickness is a particular one. Then there's also leaf chemistry is important. So certain plants have different chemicals like terpenes, for instance, that are actually very important in protecting probably against herbivores, but also can increase the flammability of different plants. There's a range of the moisture content traits, so things like leaf water potential and those sorts of things are also correlated with flammability. And we had a previous PhD student, Nigel Sultana, look at that for her project. I've got a couple of current PhD students, Eamon Matthews, going to be looking at how plant chemistry influences flammability, because there's still some very open questions with leaf chemistry and flammability. And Lexmi GP has just currently started her PhD as well too, and she's looking again into the ecophysiological traits associated with flammability. And I guess the final one, or the final group of traits to talk about, are architectural traits. And that was one of the neat things that ASAR looked at for the first time in some cases, sort of actually painstakingly measuring a lot of architectural traits, so branching patterns and associated things to demonstrate that plant architecture plays an important role, although the interesting finding there was it wasn't as important as leaf dry matter content. So what we probably have is a situation where all those traits wrapped up with moisture are very, very important for plant flammability. And then you can add on these other things like other morphological traits, leaf chemistry, and plant architecture, and these all play a role, an important role, but not as important as that of things like leaf dry matter content and moisture content.
Fabulous, Tim. Thank you. You're developing these results on flammability, and we're obviously learning a lot more about it. How can we use information on plant flammability?
Yeah, so one of the neat things with our plant flammability research has been just how practical the application of that is. So obviously in a wildfire, there's a range of different things that influence, how well a fire burns in a wildfire. So things like weather and, dryness of the atmosphere, dryness of the vegetation, windiness, and all those sorts of things play a role. Topography also plays a role. But of course, one of the big ones, the third big one, is fuel. And obviously in a wildfire situation, vegetation or plants are the main fuel or the fuel for fires. And an important component of that is how well each of those different fuel parts burn. And dead material tends to burn obviously quite well perhaps irrespective of which species it's come from, although there's probably some subtle nuances there. But live fuels are basically, influenced in part by the flammability of those species. And so if we know the flammability of different species, we can start to understand which parts of the landscape might burn better than others, but also importantly, which plant species we might deliberately use to help suppress fires. And so we could do that by identifying species with particularly low flammability and then using those in a measure called green firebreaks. So green firebreaks are strips of low flammability vegetation established across the landscape in strategic locations. And because they're low in flammability, they can help at least slow and possibly in some cases stop a fire. They also trap embers that are being blown ahead of the fire, and they can also block radiant heat. So these green firebreaks are one of the potential tools that you could actually use to help mitigate fires. And one of the neat things with green firebreaks is they could be, and they should be, multifunctional. So a number of the species that we've identified as being low flammability are some of our native plant species in New Zealand. And so if you use those native plant species, say some of the native trees, things like firefinger and broadleaf, and you put those in green firebreaks, you can not only get the benefit of fire mitigation, but you can also improve biodiversity outcomes, so improve biodiversity conservation. You can also, and that can work not just by having those species themselves, but the habitat features that they provide. So a number of our rainforest species in New Zealand, and most of our forest species are rainforest species, have, decent sized fruits that birds like. So you could actually be planting trees that not only benefit fire mitigation, but actually also benefit bird conservation as well too. Another avenue to that as well that we've been looking into recently with a project called Fighting Fire with Food is we can identify which of those species that are low in flammability also have value as mahinga kai, so traditional Maori foods, or ongoa, traditional Maori medicines as well too. So then you can actually have a food provision and a cultural reconnection component to the multifunctional benefits of these green firebreaks. So that's particularly exciting, having those sort of elements there. It doesn't need to be as extensive as a green firebreak. People can actually do a lot of good in terms of improving the chances of their house surviving a wildfire based on landscaping with low flammability plants. And there's a lot of work being done around the world to provide advice on that. And that's where our flammability testing is particularly useful for New Zealand environments. I guess the one cautionary note I would add there is that we need to remember that there's sort of no silver bullet with fire mitigation, and the wider range of tools that you use or tools that you have in your toolkit to fight a fire, the more successful you're likely to be. So we'd never advocate just doing low flammability planting or just doing a green firebreak. It should be used in conjunction with other firefighting options and a range of other sort of fire mitigation approaches as well too. But if it's used in that wider toolkit, it could be quite effective at helping prevent house loss and protecting people during wildfires. And to that end, we had in December a really exciting collaboration come to fruition with Fire and Emergency New Zealand. So we've been testing the flammability of hundreds of plants now over the decade or more we've been doing the plant barbecue work. And in December last year, FENS updated their plant flammability list to include 470 odd of the species that we've tested. So there's now a searchable plant flammability database available for fire and emergency on the Fire and Emergency New Zealand website. If people just type in "check it's all right" and go to plant flammability, the plant flammability section, they'll be able to find that, and that allows them to search a range of different species, both native plant species but also exotics, so things you might commonly find in gardens, or even, some of the things you might plant in your vegetable patch, to provide advice on how you can actually manage planting in and around your home. And a really exciting, more recent extension to this whole project has been a project called Fighting Fire with Food. So we got funding for that through the Lincoln University's Argyle Fund, and that funded Azar Alarm to do a postdoc with me, which allowed us to work on this broader project where we were testing the flammability of not just native plants, not just Mahinga-kai and Rongoa species, but also crops, pastures, vegetables, a wide range of species. And that then starts to allow us to think about how we might plan or just redesign landscapes if fire mitigation is an issue in an agricultural landscape, which indeed it is in many parts of not just New Zealand, but the world.
Awesome, Tim, and it's great to hear how your research is getting pushed out for mainstream use. That's really great, and we'll include a link to the Fire and Emergency page, the database that you mentioned, and we'll put that into the episode description for people to find as well. So,
great.
Yep, so you can find that there. So moving a little bit away from flammability as such, what about recovery of living plants following fire? What do we know? Are there species which commonly survive fires?
Yeah, so this is another aspect of fire ecology that I've been working on here in New Zealand. So there hasn't been a huge amount of work on this until fairly recently. People like George Perry and others have been working on fire ecology in New Zealand for a while now, and others sort of dipping into it as well too. But we're sort of starting to see with things like the Port Hills fires and other large-scale destructive fires that we need to know a bit more about, what impact fire has on our plants. And I should say plants, animals have not really been looked at much at all. And so there's huge gaps there. But a few years ago, I co-supervised a PhD by Ana Teixeira, a Brazilian woman who was doing her PhD through the University of Canterbury. And one of the chapters that she looked at and some of the work that we've published was she put some plots out after the Port Hills fires in forested areas to categorise and understand how different plant species were responding to or had responded to the Port Hills fires. And she also did a literature review too, sort of looking around, what information was available on, how different New Zealand species responded to fire. And it was quite interesting. I mean, there were certain species like cabbage tree, like tree fuchsia, that were actually quite strong responders, quite strong resprouters following the fire. They had, in fact, both those species had 100% resprouting rates in the plots that Anna looked at. Another one that was, quite had reasonably high rates of resprouting was mahoe. Now, some of these plants are probably just responding to defoliation, so they've not had an evolutionary history of fire. They're rainforest plants, but they've had to deal with things like browsing, which defoliates them, drought, frosts, snowfall, those sorts of things that are defoliating events. And it's heartening to see that some of these species can actually, resprout reasonably well following fire. However, there's a number of species in the New Zealand flora that don't do particularly well following a fire. So, for instance, one of the Hebe species, Veronica salicifolia, that we looked at on the Banks Peninsula, none of those resprouted at all. Another one, of course, Kunzia, our Carnuka, doesn't resprout, but Carnuka is a relatively recent arrival from New Zealand, from Australia rather, to New Zealand. So probably in the last couple of million years or thereabouts. And it has a different fire strategy. So it has the adults killed by fire, but then the seeds either stored in the soil seed bank or stored as in the canopy, a mechanism or a strategy called serotiny. Those germinate quite readily following a fire and do quite successfully in the post-fire environment. And Manuka is another species, again, come across from Australia in the last couple of million years probably, that actually, resprouts, is killed mostly by, the adults are mostly killed by fire, but has serotiny and recovers the population via seed germination. But there's a whole host of, some of our, classic New Zealand species that don't seem to do, particularly well following fire. Some of our conifers, for instance, don't appear to do very well. Our beech trees are also quite susceptible to fire. A lot of this, as it is everywhere, is heavily dependent on just how intense the fire is, so the fire behaviour when it goes through a stand. But some of the work that's been done in the past by people like Susan Weiser from Manaki Whenua Landcare Research, looking at a fire through mountain beech forest, showed that the beech trees really didn't resprout after fire, and while it took a bit of a time for them to die off, a lot of them that had been scorched, were dead within 5 years, or virtually all of them were dead within 5 years. So, yeah, it varies very much, and I guess the key thing to remember here is through evolutionary time, most New Zealand ecosystems were largely fire-free. So our forests could go hundreds, if not thousands of years in a given patch without ever getting a fire. Some of our other ecosystems, like the sort of wetland areas, seem to have had more frequent fire in the past, but it really took for humans to arrive in the two main waves for fire to become a significant component of the New Zealand landscape. And when it did arrive, when humans used it, it was a transformational disturbance. So our substantial deforestation of New Zealand has been driven by humans' use of fire.
Great content, thanks, Tim. I wanted to ask you about fire behaviour, and in the New Zealand context, where are we at with that? And is there research or advice available for people? Like, the way I'm thinking about this is I'm aware there are people out there concerned about, the effects of climate change and potentially seeing wildfires in their area. And beyond the flammability or the recovery that we've talked about, and actually thinking about how a fire might behave, where are we at for New Zealand, and is there advice available to people?
Yeah, so there's been some really great research done over the years on this by Scion. So by Grant Pearce, when he was at Scion, he's now at Fire and Emergency New Zealand, and by Veronica Clifford, his colleague at at Scion, and others who have recently sort of started working for Scion, like Shana Gross. And so if you go to so Scion's got a dedicated rural fire research team, and there's a number of resources that they have there that people can get access to that talk about fire behaviour in different ecosystems. It's interesting you sort of talk about plant flammability and fire behaviour. That's one of the big next steps that we need to do with our plant flammability research, is work out exactly how well this information on plant flammability can be scaled up to help us understand fire behaviour. And so we had plans to do that as part of a PhD project being run by Shanta Marga-Buddha, who recently finished her PhD, but COVID put a stop to those plans, and she had to reschedule and look at various other things, including some plant flammability research and actually some trait work on plant chemistry. So there's information out there. Fire and Emergency New Zealand also has a dedicated wildfire team. So there's quite a bit of work. University of Canterbury's been doing some work on this. George Perry at University of Auckland has in the past dabbled in fire modelling or worked on fire modelling and some fire behaviour. So there's definitely some really good information out there. But from my perspective, that's one of the key missing links in our work, is how we can best scale up the plant flammability research, which we think will contribute to providing some really important nuances as to how fires behave. So quite a lot of the fire behaviour models, just because of the sheer complexity of them, have tended to need to reduce fuels to fairly sort of homogeneous things, so all shrubland or all grasses, and kind of treat those as the same, which is completely understandable as to the process. But we think we can start to add in some extra information, like how different species burn, and that'll hopefully, I guess we'll see, improve some of these fire behaviour models. But definitely check out the work that both Scion has been doing, their rural fire research team, and FENZ, Fire and Emergency New Zealand, has a number of really excellent resources on their website, including some really good stuff that provides guidelines on how houses can be prepared, best prepared for wildfires, and what are the range of different measures you could do to help improve that.
Oh, that's awesome, Tim. Look, before we finish up, probably more on a personal, lighthearted note, I just wondered whether, you struck me as a man that spent a lot of time out in the field or doing research through the course of your career, and whether there are any memorable moments you had from your career that really stand out and you'd like to share with the listeners.
Yeah, so I guess there's sort of two broadly generic ones that are, I think the first one's probably something that anyone who gets out in the bush gets to experience at some point, just going to some amazing new places. For my PhD, I remember going to a slot canyon that I'd identified some rainforest in that wasn't known by the landowner. And so I kind of, when I got in there, got the real sense that, I was potentially one of the first, Europeans to ever get into that particular part of the world, and just seeing some amazing places. I guess more broadly, one of the really cool things with science is the wide range of wonderful people that you get, and really smart, intelligent and keen people that you get to work with, especially our students. Like, they're just amazing. And I've had some really brilliant collaborators and students over the years that, it's just made an absolute joy to work with, and continues to make it a joy to work with. But if there was one particular thing that, stood out to me, and it's actually funny, I'm sitting here at my desk and looking at a card that's got a photograph of the plant on it. it's rediscovering a missing population of an endangered dry rainforest tree around my hometown with my mum. So this was a plant, it's called Uline, Cadelia pentastylus. It's this lovely, big, tall, dry rainforest tree that grows out in these semi-arid landscapes where it really doesn't look like it should. It's got really dense wood. It's very well drought adapted. And there was this old record of the Sydney Herbarium back in the early 1900s of a collection near Gunnedah, and I think the biggest issue was that they just gave, as they often did in those times, just said Gunnedah and didn't really give a proper location for it. But what they'd done in sort of assigning a location for it, they'd put it in the wrong patch of vegetation, and so I was working on dry rainforests for my PhD and had thoroughly scoured the patch where it was supposed to be, and of course not found it. But it was one of Mum's colleagues took the husband of one of Mum's colleagues brought a unidentified tree branch to her, like one that was flowering or fruiting at the time, to her, and sort of said, "Oh, what's this?" And I'd just recently been surveying some stands of Uline a bit further north, and I went, "Oh, hang on a second, I think that's what we've got." And I can clearly remember that the day that we went and looked at it for the first time, because it was actually the 20th anniversary just a couple of months ago. It was Christmas Eve in 2004, and it was a blazing hot day in my hometown of Gunnedah, and me and Mum and my then girlfriend, now wife, Penny, went out to check out this population up a hill, and I scrambled up the hill and found, to great delight, and sort of waved with a big smile on my face down the hill to the others who are less keen to scramble up the hill, and the sensible ones who are less keen to scramble up the hill in the heat, and sort of gave a big thumbs up to say that I'd found it. But Mum and I went on to document that population, the rediscovery of that population, basically 100 years later. And that was also at the very southern limit of that species. So it was actually a 30, 40 kilometre range extension of the known populations at the time, or confirmed populations at the time. So so that was really exciting. And then we published that in a small little regional journal in Australia. But that was my very first paper. So my first paper was co-authored by my mum and represented the rediscovery of a really cool relictual dry rainforest species. So that's probably if I was going to be quite personal about it, that's probably the event in my career that most stands out.
Well, that's fabulous. That ticks quite a few boxes. I can see why that's such a big deal for you, Tim. Well, just before we end up, is there anything else that you'd like to say to the listeners?
I guess one of the big things to think about is, fire in the New Zealand context and how that's likely to change under climate change. So we're already starting to see some very destructive wildfires in recent years around New Zealand, which is following the trend elsewhere around the world. So places like Australia, California, the Mediterranean basin in Europe are getting very extreme wildfires. So, wildfires well beyond the limits of what those very fire-prone landscapes have experienced in the past. But we're clearly not immune to that here in New Zealand. We've had things like the two lots of Port Hills fires, the Lake Ohau fires, which were incredibly destructive, but thankfully no serious injuries to people. And we're starting to see, really significant wildfires here in New Zealand. And I guess the thing to keep in mind with that is, the predictions with global climate change are such that we're going to have increased temperatures. We're going to have drier environments, at least on the east coast of both major islands. We're going to have windier weather, and we're going to have lower relative humidity. And all of those things are conducive to more destructive wildfires. And so wildfires are very much something that many parts of New Zealand really, really need to think about and to take seriously. And I'd urge people to sort of look into what the wildfire threat is in their community, and if it's a considerable threat, then they need to start thinking about what are the things they can do to not just protect their home, but also to encourage their neighbours to do that as well too, because wildfires are a natural hazard that is best tackled at the landscape level, across multiple land tenures and land management classes. And it also is one that if just one or two people don't do their bit, so don't manage their land in such a way that fire is mitigated, then that can actually be very highly detrimental to the entire community, because fire kind of it actually sort of acts, particularly through houses, a bit like a virus. Once it sort of gets in, it can then very quickly spread, from house to house. And we've seen that with, complete devastation in places like California. Again, this year, it seems like every year we have a new set of catastrophic fires in California or somewhere else around the world. And so this is something that's already happening now here in New Zealand, and it's something that both the general public but also decision makers need to take very, very seriously and have a serious think about how we can manage this natural hazard in New Zealand. The advantage we have in New Zealand is there's actually a bunch of nature-based solutions that are amenable and at hand. And as I mentioned, green firebreaks is one of those. We can actually have multiple benefits by restoring native bush in parts of New Zealand, because that native bush is generally much lower in flammability than a lot of the exotic species that we might otherwise plant. So think invasive species like gorse or plantations like pines and eucalypts. And so, we can, New Zealand's a place like many other Pacific islands where, we can actually get multiple wins out of, fire mitigation. We can get biodiversity conservation wins, we can get food provision wins, we can get cultural reconnection wins as well too. So, New Zealand could easily be an exemplar of fire management for the globe, in part because it's not yet quite as severe as what it is in other places, but also because of the fortuitous nature of our natural world and what our forests, how our forests might actually actively help us suppress fires.
Great. I think on that high point, Tim, we'll wrap it up and leave it there.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much for joining me, and that's amazing content. Very interesting. Thank you for joining me.
No worries. Great. Happy to be on there, Adam. Thanks a lot. See you later.
Tim, along with his students and collaborators, have made a major contribution to the science and ultimately our understanding of plant flammability. He describes a situation where in pre-human times fire wasn't a particularly influential factor in New Zealand's ecology, but that changed rapidly with waves of human colonisation and now with the effects of climate change. Tim highlights the opportunity for New Zealand to achieve multiple outcomes from fire mitigation measures such as green firebreaks, given the range of low flammability options among our native flora and the possibilities these open up for biodiversity restoration, cultural use and reconnection, and achieving a range of ecosystem services along the way. Tim sends a serious message that as climate change continues to ramp up, in eastern areas in particular, conditions for wildfires are becoming more favourable, and now is the time to consider the degree of risk in a location important to you and take active steps to prepare and encourage others to prepare as well. Tim's work on flammability is opening the door for enhanced understanding and modelling of fire behaviour, and it sounds very much like the sooner this next step can be advanced, the better informed and prepared we can be. I'm grateful that Tim was very open in sharing his amazing knowledge on the intersection between fire and flora in New Zealand, and it seems clear to me that his work is only going to become more important as time goes on. Thank you for your contribution to the podcast, Tim, and all the best with your future work. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Nature Conversations podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, remember to subscribe so that you can be notified of future episodes. If you'd like to help support the production of the podcast, you can do so via my Patreon account. The link is in the episode description. Thanks very much for listening, and be sure to check in again soon.